In the dead of night, with only his most trusted advisors present, King Charles signed a royal decree that would forever sever Camilla's family's ties to the very walls they had called home. No one saw it coming, least of all, Camilla herself. It was an act shrouded in secrecy, carried out with the kind of precision reserved for matters of state that could not, under any circumstance, be allowed to leak before the ink had dried. The corridors of Buckingham Palace were silent, yet the weight of the moment seemed to press down on every inch of stone, as though the building itself understood the enormity of what had just been set in motion. The document was brief, but its implications were vast. In a matter of moments, every housing right, every residential privilege, and every key held by members of Camilla's family to royal properties was revoked. From the grandeur of Sandringham's private quarters to the quiet grace of Windsor's secluded cottages, their access was erased permanently. No discussion, no negotiation, no grace period. Charles's pen had closed the chapter with a single, deliberate stroke. But this was not a decision born from a single night's reflection. Hours earlier, whispers had already begun swirling of an urgent, behind-closed-doors meeting between King Charles, Princess Anne, and Prince William. Those who caught glimpses of the gathering noted the tension etched on their faces. This was not the easy camaraderie of family. It was the steely resolve of leaders about to take a stand. The discussion, by all accounts, had been laced with words like integrity, public trust, and line in the sand. At the heart of it all was an alleged breach of trust so serious, it threatened to taint the image of the monarchy if left unanswered. For Charles, the decision carved through more than politics. It cut into the marrow of his personal life. This was his wife's family, the people she had stood beside for decades, and yet his oath to the crown demanded that the monarchy's sanctity come before personal ties. It was a moment of reckoning that every monarch dreads, choosing between the stability of the institution and the comfort of the heart. He knew there would be a price, not only in the political sense, but within the walls of his own home. Camilla, when she learned of the decree, reacted first with stunned disbelief. The words were so severe, so absolute, that they seemed unreal, like some elaborate misunderstanding that could be swiftly clarified. But disbelief curdled into outrage when she grasped the permanence of it. This was not a suspension or a warning. It was exile from the spaces her family had come to view as their own. The shock was visceral, the anger immediate. Still, even in her anger, there lingered the unspoken question. Why now? Why this moment? After years of uneasy coexistence between her relatives and the rest of the royal household. The answer lay not in the day's events, but in a long, tangled history of quiet grievances, accumulating mistrust, and private confrontations that had, at last, reached their breaking point. But the true story of this seismic decision began long before the ink dried, rooted in years of tension, whispers, and betrayals that the public never saw. For years, tensions simmered quietly until private reports surfaced, suggesting that Camilla's family had begun treating royal residences as their personal empire. It started subtly, so subtly that even those closest to the king dismissed the early murmurs as gossip. Yet, behind the gleaming facade of public unity, the foundations of trust within the royal household were beginning to crack. Members of Camilla's inner circle had grown comfortable, too comfortable, moving through corridors and across estates as though they owned the deeds themselves. What was once a privilege granted out of grace and acceptance began to morph into a sense of entitlement, one that did not go unnoticed. At first, it was the small things, a guest list that seemed unusually long for a private gathering, an extended stay at a residence meant for short-term visits. But then came whispers of unofficial renovations carried out without the faintest nod of approval from Charles. Rooms within historic estates were altered, not to preserve their heritage, but to suit the tastes of those who had no right to change them. Priceless antiques were relocated, private gardens were re-landscaped, and royal staff were directed to attend events that had nothing to do with official duty. These were not just lapses in protocol, they were calculated acts that chipped away at the dignity of the crown. The palace staff, trained to serve in silence, began to murmur among themselves. Their testimonies, shared in hushed voices over closed doors, spoke of arrogance and disregard. Long-serving attendants who had dedicated decades to royal service now found themselves undermined by individuals who had walked into privilege without earning it. The quiet discontent spread through the ranks like a shadow creeping across the marble floors. And though no one dared confront Camilla directly, the message began to find its way upward. It was Princess Anne who first put words to the unease. She had seen enough in her years to recognize when boundaries were being crossed. Her warnings to Charles were delivered in private, her voice calm but edged with urgency. She reminded him of the fragility of the monarchy's image, that public perception was as delicate as crystal, and once cracked, it could never be restored. Charles listened, but he hesitated. He knew that acting too soon could fracture his marriage, yet doing nothing risked far more. Meanwhile, the world beyond the palace gates saw none of this. On public stages, Charles and Camilla appeared united, smiling for the cameras, exchanging pleasantries at events. But those who looked closely could see the faint strain in their expressions, the slight stiffness in their body language. And in the shadows, rumors began to swirl that Prince William, ever protective of the monarchy's long-term stability, was growing impatient. He watched the overreach with a tightening jaw, understanding that every day of inaction weakened the crown's moral authority. The truth was unavoidable. This was not a matter of simple overstepping. It was a pattern, an erosion of the respect and restraint that had long been expected within the royal sphere. The weight of the monarchy was built on discipline, tradition, and loyalty, and Camilla's family had begun to treat those principles as optional. And yet, what pushed Charles to act wasn't just mismanagement. It was an incident so personal, so unforgivable, it left the king with no choice. It happened at Sandringham, a moment that would ignite the fuse on decades of royal restraint. What began as an unassuming winter weekend quickly spiraled into a scene that would be whispered about in the corridors of the palace for years to come. Camilla's relative, emboldened by years of unchecked access, had orchestrated a gathering so extravagant, so brazenly out of place, that it jarred every unwritten rule of royal discretion. It was not a family dinner or a quiet celebration. It was a lavish, sprawling affair, complete with guests who had no legitimate reason to step foot on royal grounds, let alone inside the sanctity of Sandringham's private quarters. The damage was not only in its ostentation, but in its recklessness. Somewhere between the laughter and clinking glasses, a line was crossed, one that could not be smoothed over with apologies. Security officers, attempting to carry out routine checks, stumbled upon a disturbing breach. Private royal documents, locked away for decades, had been accessed. It was unclear whether through arrogance, ignorance, or intent, but the files had been disturbed, and the trust they represented was shattered. The palace has always guarded its papers with near-sacred diligence, for within them lie the truths and decisions that shaped the monarchy. To see them mishandled was not simply a protocol violation, it was an insult to the very institution. Then came the discovery that struck with a more personal blow. In the quiet aftermath, staff searching the rooms stumbled upon several personal belongings of the late Queen Elizabeth II, items that had been kept in their precise places since her passing, now displaced, some left in places that suggested they had been handled carelessly. To those who revered her memory, it was nothing short of sacrilege. For Charles, who still carried the weight of his mother's legacy like a mantle upon his shoulders, this was unforgivable. Eyewitness accounts from long-serving attendants painted an even darker picture. They recounted hearing Camilla's cousin making light of royal customs, mocking the traditions that had defined the monarchy for centuries. It wasn't just insolence, it was a display of contempt for the very heritage they were privileged to enjoy. For many in service, that night confirmed what they had feared. Certain individuals in Camilla's orbit did not see themselves as guests in the crown's world, but as entitled occupants. Catherine, ever the model of composure, could not let it pass. In a quiet but searing exchange, she confronted the offending cousin, her words measured but edged with unmistakable disapproval. Those nearby described the atmosphere as frozen, no shouting, no theatrics, just the icy weight of someone defending the dignity of the monarchy. The cousin brushed her off with a smirk, a gesture that would only deepen the outrage. Later that night, Charles received the call. It was urgent, its tone clipped, the kind of message that sweeps sleep away in an instant. Details spilled out about the gathering, the documents, the Queen's belongings, the insults. With every word, his resolve hardened. This was no longer about vague discontent or quiet disobedience. This was a direct strike against the sanctity of the royal household, carried out under his own roof. But before Charles could move, it was Princess Anne who delivered the final push, arming her brother with evidence that could no longer be ignored. When the Queen's only daughter speaks, even kings listen, and Anne's words carry the weight of both truth and consequence. She did not come to her brother empty-handed or with vague complaints. Instead, she placed before him a carefully compiled record, months in the making, detailing every breach, every misuse of privilege, and every moment Camilla's family had stepped beyond the invisible boundaries of royal conduct. The list was not short. It contained incidents small and large, each one a thread in the tapestry of growing disrespect. Together, they painted a picture that could not be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. It was a pattern. Anne's tone was firm, but there was something more beneath it, an unshakable devotion to the monarchy as their mother had envisioned it. She reminded Charles of the Queen's unwavering commitment to integrity, of her insistence that the monarchy must be above reproach, even within its own ranks. Anne's voice softened only when she spoke of their mother's legacy, warning that allowing the current behavior to continue would stain not just the present reign, but the memory of the one who came before. The emotion in her words was not for herself, but for the crown, and that made them impossible to ignore. Her frustration was palpable. For Anne, this was not simply about Camilla's relatives enjoying a few extra comforts. It was about the erosion of values that had defined the royal institution for centuries. Every unchecked overreach, every act of entitlement, chipped away at the foundation of something she had spent her entire life defending. To Anne, tradition was not a relic. It was the glue holding the monarchy together in an era where public opinion could turn with a single headline. It was clear she was not alone in her concern. Though neither openly admitted it at first, William's stance aligned with Anne's. Both saw the danger of allowing this kind of behavior to fester unchecked. Privately, they had exchanged words on the matter, their shared determination forming a quiet alliance. In their view, Charles needed to act not only as a brother and husband, but as the sovereign, and that meant protecting the monarchy's image, even if it meant stepping into personal conflict. At some point, Anne had even taken her concerns directly to Camilla. That meeting had been civil in tone, but cold in spirit. Anne had spoken plainly about what was unacceptable, drawing on her authority as both a senior royal and the daughter of the late queen. Camilla, unaccustomed to such direct challenges from within the family, met her words with stony silence. No agreement was reached, no understanding found. When the conversation ended, the air between them had turned icy, and neither sought to warm it. Now, the weight of decision rested on Charles's shoulders. He could attempt to preserve peace within his marriage, sidestepping the growing tension, or he could take decisive action that would send a message to both the public and the private halls of the palace. The choice was agonizing, but the evidence was irrefutable. Charles chose discipline, but the manner in which he acted would leave Camilla feeling publicly humiliated and politically cornered. Under the golden glow of Buckingham's study lamps, Charles lifted the pen, knowing that what he was about to sign would alter the power balance of his reign. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Before him lay the decree, its crisp parchment carrying the weight of months of frustration, evidence, and sleepless nights. Every word had been carefully chosen by the legal team, every clause crafted to withstand challenge. There was no going back once his signature met the page. Around him stood a small circle of witnesses, each present for reasons that went beyond protocol. William was there, his expression steady but unyielding, silently affirming that this was the right step for the monarchy's survival. Anne stood on the opposite side, her gaze fixed on her brother, the weight of their earlier conversations still lingering in the air. A pair of senior royal solicitors flanked the desk, their presence ensuring that what was decided tonight could never be undone by anyone, Camilla included. The decree's language was clear, leaving no room for interpretation. It stripped Camilla's family of every residential privilege granted by the crown, from permanent lodgings to temporary stays. It revoked keys, titles of tenancy, and access to any dwelling within royal grounds. The words were firm, but they carried a tone of finality that even the most skilled advocate could not twist or soften. It was more than an eviction. It was a symbolic severing of ties, one that echoed the crown's ultimate authority over who belongs within its walls. When Charles placed his signature upon the document, he did so with a hand that trembled not from uncertainty, but from the emotional gravity of the moment. This was his wife's family, people he had dined with, laughed with, allowed into the deepest sanctuaries of royal life. And yet, his oath to the monarchy demanded this sacrifice. The pen scratched across the paper, sealing a fate that would reverberate far beyond the palace gates. Almost instantly, he turned to the head of palace security. Quiet instructions were given discreetly, but decisively. Locks were to be changed, access passes revoked, and personal possessions carefully removed. There would be no scene, no visible confrontation, but the message would be unmistakable. The grace extended to them had ended. In that moment, the toll of kingship pressed heavily on Charles. He had chosen duty over love, stability over peace at home. Yet, somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew this decision would mark a turning point in his marriage, a shift from partnership to quiet opposition. What he had signed was not just a legal order. It was a declaration that the crown would not be compromised, no matter the personal cost. And with the legal barriers embedded deep within the decree, there was nothing Camilla could do to reverse it. Not through appeal, influence, or public sympathy. The crown's word, once written, was law. The ink was barely dry when word began to leak, first inside palace corridors, then into the world beyond. When Camilla learned of the decree, she didn't see it as royal protocol. She saw it as a betrayal. And betrayal demands a response. The news struck her like a sudden blow, delivered not by a political rival or a hostile press, but by the man she had stood beside through years of public scrutiny and private trials. In her mind, this was not a strategic act for the sake of the monarchy. It was a calculated humiliation. The anger came swiftly, fueled by disbelief. And before the day had passed, she was determined to confront Charles directly. Behind the walls of Clarence House, the confrontation unfolded in words that would never be made public, but would be remembered by those who heard them. Reports from within described raised voices echoing through the corridors, a rare but undeniable break from the measured tones the royal couple usually maintained. Camilla demanded explanations, insisting that she had been blindsided, that her family had been treated as interlopers instead of trusted companions. Charles, though calm in his delivery, refused to reverse the decision. He spoke of duty, of integrity, of the crown's need to remain untarnished. To Camilla, these were just rehearsed justifications, masking a choice that put the monarchy before his marriage. When it became clear that Charles would not bend, Camilla turned to her own network. She summoned her family, gathering them behind closed doors to decide their course of action. To them, this was not just a loss of privilege, it was an insult to their standing, an erasure of the acceptance they believed had been secured years ago. The discussion was sharp and strategic. They knew they could not overturn the decree directly, but they could shape the narrative beyond palace walls. It was not long before select media outlets began to receive carefully worded leaks. These painted Camilla not as a schemer or opportunist, but as a wronged figure, a woman whose loyalty to her husband had been rewarded with humiliation. The timing of these stories was deliberate, calculated to coincide with public attention still fixed on the scandal. Camilla's team ensured that her side of the story found sympathetic ears, and for a brief moment, the tide of opinion seemed uncertain. Yet, the ripple effect within the palace was equally swift. The first signs of a fracture between Charles and Camilla's inner circles began to surface. Advisors who once worked seamlessly across both sides now moved with caution, wary of being seen as aligned too closely with one or the other. The sense of unity at the top had been disrupted, replaced by an invisible fault line. But William and Anne were not caught off guard. They anticipated the pushback and moved quickly to close ranks around Charles's decision. In private, they reassured him that the monarchy's long-term stability outweighed the noise of the moment. In public, they maintained composure, refusing to be drawn into the emotional undertones of the matter. Their silent but firm support gave Charles the reinforcement he needed to hold his ground. But the public's reaction would add an entirely new layer to the crisis, one that neither side had anticipated. As headlines blared, the nation took sides, and the verdict from the streets to social media was swift and unforgiving. Within hours, polling numbers began to emerge, and they told a story that would send a jolt through the palace's already tense atmosphere. An overwhelming majority, nearly 3 out of every 4 respondents, stood firmly behind Charles's decision. To them, it was not an act of cruelty, but a demonstration of strength. A long overdue step to protect the sanctity of the monarchy from personal overreach. The sentiment was clear. The king had acted as a sovereign first and a husband second, and that choice resonated with those who feared the institution had grown too lenient. Loyal royalists wasted no time making their voices heard. From community gatherings to radio call-ins, they hailed the move as a masterstroke of leadership. Some spoke with pride about Charles restoring boundaries that had blurred in recent years. Others, more emotional, called it a fulfillment of the late Queen's vision, a reminder that the monarchy was not to be bent for personal comfort. Words like integrity, duty, and respect echoed repeatedly in their statements, framing the decision as both necessary and noble. But where there was praise, there was also fury. Camilla's allies, both inside Britain and abroad, condemned the act as a public shaming. In interviews and op-eds, they painted it as a betrayal of trust, a move that undermined not only her position, but also the stability of the royal marriage. Some went further, suggesting that the king had been influenced by factions within the family, an accusation aimed squarely at William and Anne. Their rhetoric was sharp, designed to plant seeds of doubt about the unity of the royal household. The media, seizing on the heightened tension, began to dig deeper into Camilla's family history. Stories resurfaced of past disputes, questionable associations, and minor scandals that had long been buried. The tabloid frenzy reignited old wounds, dragging events from decades past back into the court of public opinion. Every headline was another blow, eroding whatever sympathy Camilla's circle had managed to stir in the immediate aftermath. Internationally, the coverage was just as intense. Foreign commentators framed the move as Charles's boldest act since ascending the throne, a calculated gamble to solidify his authority and distance himself from the perception of being swayed by personal relationships. Some lauded it as a power play worthy of historic monarchs. Others warned it could deepen divisions within the family that would be impossible to heal. The global spotlight, once a source of ceremonial celebration, now magnified every fissure. When Buckingham Palace finally issued its statement, it was everything the public had come to expect from an institution that speaks sparingly but with precision. Brief, sharp, and unapologetic, it affirmed that the decision had been made in the best interest of the crown and would remain in place. No elaboration, no opening for debate. The firmness of the words was deliberate, sending a message that the matter was closed, at least from the palace's perspective. But if the public thought the matter was settled, they underestimated Camilla's will to fight. Behind closed doors, the king and queen consort faced each other not as partners, but as political adversaries. The air between them was taut, charged with the weight of weeks of escalating tension. Camilla entered Charles's study with a singular purpose: to have the decree overturned. She did not waste time on pleasantries or softened words. Her demand was blunt, her tone unwavering. This decision, she said, was not just an insult to her family, but a public attack on her own standing as queen consort. She expected a reversal, immediate and unconditional. Charles listened, but his silence was not one of hesitation. It was the measured pause of a man who had already decided. When he finally spoke, the refusal was as steady as it was final. The decree would remain in place. There would be no compromises, no quiet amendments hidden in the fine print. His voice carried none of the warmth that might once have softened a conversation like this. Instead, it was laced with the authority of the crown, a reminder that this was not a husband speaking to his wife, but a monarch defending his reign. Her response was sharp, laced with years of frustration that had never fully found their way to the surface. Personal accusations began to spill out grievances that reached far beyond the issue at hand. She spoke of times she had stood by him when others would not, of the sacrifices she had made for their marriage, of how quickly loyalty could be repaid with cold formality. Charles, in turn, countered with his own unspoken resentments, his own wounds buried under the weight of royal duty. Words long left unsaid now found their way into the open, and with each exchange, the distance between them widened. It was in that moment, somewhere between the accusations and the silence, that the breaking point arrived. Not in a dramatic gesture, not in an explosive declaration, but in the quiet realization that whatever trust had once bound them had been irreversibly altered. They could still share public stages, still smile for the cameras, still stand side by side on ceremonial occasions, but behind closed doors, the fracture would remain. Charles stood firm. He reminded her, not in anger but in resolve, that the monarchy existed beyond their marriage, beyond personal alliances, beyond family loyalties. His oath was to the crown first, and to the survival of an institution that would outlast them both. For him, this was not cruelty. It was necessity. When the conversation ended, there was no reconciliation, only a lingering stillness, heavy with the knowledge that something had shifted forever. She left the study without another word, and he did not call her back. Both understood, in that unspoken exchange, that the decision had cost them more than either had anticipated. And yet, even after this final clash, a shadow loomed because one last royal document was still locked away in the king's desk. What the world didn't know was that the decree contained a hidden clause, one that could reshape the line of succession itself. Buried deep within the formal language, beyond the legal jargon and ceremonial phrases, was a provision so precise and so far-reaching that only a handful of people inside the palace knew it existed. On the surface, the order had been about removing Camilla's family from royal housing, but behind its plain appearance lay a carefully crafted safeguard, one designed to protect the future reign of William, George, and Charlotte from any potential interference. The clause was written to look almost administrative, yet its implications stretched far beyond the question of who could live on royal grounds. It created new restrictions that quietly cut off Camilla's influence over certain royal charities, trusts, and ceremonial appointments. No member of her extended family could hold decision-making authority in matters that touched the crown's assets or legacy. It was a tightening of the circle around the monarchy's most sensitive levers of power, locking them in the hands of those directly in line to the throne. For Charles, it was not just about ending an overreach. It was about securing the dynasty's path forward without leaving any cracks for others to slip through. Speculation inside the palace was intense. Some believed the hidden provision was drafted after private warnings from senior advisors that should Charles's health falter in the years ahead, any unchecked influence from outside the direct line of succession could complicate William's transition to the throne. Others whispered that this was William's condition for supporting the housing decree, that the move would not just correct a present problem, but also safeguard the monarchy's long-term stability. Either way, the clause ensured that George and Charlotte's inheritance, both symbolic and material, would remain untouched by competing loyalties. Anne's discreet approval was essential. Without her quiet endorsement, the language of the clause might have been softened or stripped out entirely. She saw it, not as an attack on Camilla, but as a reinforcement of the monarchy's core structure, as an insurance policy against instability. Her reputation for precision and discipline meant that when her signature backed the amendment, few dared to challenge it. Yet, those who understood the depth of the move also knew it carried risks. Stripping Camilla's family from housing was one thing. Reaching into the spheres of influence and power they might one day have controlled was something else entirely. Should the clause ever become public knowledge, it could ignite a fresh wave of outrage, not just from Camilla's camp, but from those who saw it as a consolidation of power into too few hands. The potential for a deeper family rift was real, and those involved understood they had set in motion something that could not easily be undone. It was, in truth, a beginning rather than an end. If Charles was willing to bury such a clause here, what other changes might be quietly drafted and signed in the months to come? For those watching closely, it seemed the king was only just beginning his house cleaning, tightening the monarchy's defenses one silent signature at a time. And as the dust settled, one truth became clear. This wasn't just about housing, it was about the future of the monarchy itself. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.